So today we're going to learn a lot of new things about China. I hope this is really exciting and super interesting for you as well. So I chose this perspective of China first because I wanted to kind of look at how China works with the rest of Asia and even as far as Africa. Also missing from this is Australia. So one of my favorite maps to look at is a topology map, and looking at the mountain ranges and basically the ups and downs of the country. So I'm going to try to cover as many cities and locations as possible in China, but one thing I would say is that I'm particularly looking at the places that look most fun to live in, and sometimes those are located along the rivers or also along the coastline, but there are a lot of really interesting inland areas as well. One thing that's really hard to see from the Google Maps, because the lakes are so green on the satellite imagery, is these inland lakes, and there's actually quite a number of inland lakes. There's not a whole lot, but there's a significant amount of rivers and lakes in inland China. So it's also really hard to see this on a map, but Hong Kong is part of this river system here that you're just looking at called Pearl River. Again, it's hard to see that on a map. So I read just now that Hong Kong actually purchased the rights of this entire river back in the 1960s, and actually about 70% of all the water in Hong Kong depends on this river, as like imported from this river. So don't give up on me yet. This is actually super important. We're going to talk about the Yellow River next. So this doesn't actually flow through Beijing, but Beijing, as you may know, is the capital of all of China, and very important politically. So by understanding the Yellow River, since it's so close to Beijing and so huge, it may help us understand kind of the quote-unquote real politics of China. So essentially understanding all the major cities, and we even discover kind of a secret capital of China. So it's really important to realize that this whole area is kind of a delta, so it's a massive kind of floodplain, and it's shifted significantly over the course of even 100 years. Next, we're going to talk about the Yangtze River. This is the largest river in China. That last river was the second largest. But the interesting thing here is that although you may be able to find political solutions along the Yellow River, this goes to Shanghai, which may be able to solve a lot of China's business problems. one really interesting thing about China is that the population didn't really start to rise rapidly until about the 14, 15, or even 1600s. So that's quite recently. So these graphs are really actually good news. You can see that there's actually kind of a very interesting phenomenon here. You see like one or even two or three lobes of kind of like population. So one final comment is this actually means a very important area of research, like why these lobes would show up around 20 years old, 40 and above. So you'll notice here that China is actually the second most after India in terms of density. So to me, the language maps are some of the most helpful to understand what's going on culturally, and also the ethno-linguistic maps. So it appears that China believes in something very different. So they call it folk religion, but I'm going to call it just like family religion, say. So one interesting thing is that these Taoist beliefs actually are skewed to the far south, but even into Southeast Asia or the west side. So it's interesting to point out that the ancestral beliefs are actually moving further north, but these are kind of moving into Thailand and other areas. In China, they start with the letter D and not T for Taoism. So this map kind of gives some proof that Buddhism is actually not a true Chinese religion. It's actually more based out of India, right? So you see in the far west there. From this, you can basically tell that comparing the two numbers, like some parts of China have like 50% or more Muslim, but there is no part of China that has anything above, like, say, 5% Christian. So this is actually one of my favorite maps of China, right? It gives you a very good idea about where the rain is. And in general, you can see that there's a lot of cultural things going on in the south there, diversity in languages, and also climate is very important in that area. So, on contrast, some of the most biodiverse regions are actually kind of in the center of China here. You can see this middle area. So I just want to stop everything for a second and realize that China's wealth is about 10 times that of India's. So I was extremely surprised at the difference. So if you look at this graph carefully, you can tell in the early 1990s, China was actually lower than India. And then everything changed basically in the 90s. But it really wasn't until about the year 2000 or so that things really started to take off in China. So this problem is actually happening throughout the world, but I think particularly in Asia, right? So you basically see that most of the wealth in China is gravitating towards the coast. So I personally feel there's a lot of misconceptions on the exchange rate, but in general, what they're saying is like 7 to 1, right? So before around 1994, China was perhaps trying to do a general policy of 1 to 1 with the dollar. So it's kind of hard to see this from the map, but what you can basically see is that China is exporting a lot of electronics and computers, right? So you can kind of look at what this is, but it's kind of surprising just how much of that they're doing as opposed to like things like lamps and plastics or even textiles. So essentially like half their economy right now is electronics related, and in some way that's really bad because a lot of these electronics just become junk in a matter of like 10 years or even less. So I really wish I was like more of an expert with studying the import side of things, but in general you can see that there's quite a lot of tourism, a surprising amount, and actually there some of this ICT is basically like technology services. So that's kind of good because then you have like cross-cultural and work that's being done in many different countries. But in general, the imports look interesting. So there's another graph here that I want to show you. So from this graph, you start to see that around 2009, things started to get out of control in China for imports, right? They essentially doubled their total imports, which is quite a lot, right? So that happened in 2009. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, you had a housing bubble that crashed, right? So it's kind of a weird thing that the economies would be exactly opposite, but in some senses, China did make some progress quite recently in 2014, right? So they dropped it by, significant, almost $500 billion there, right? So China has had made some progress recently. So one thing to realize here is that if you look at this map, a lot of the industry is the heavy industry is done in northern China. So I've seen some pictures, and it looks like they are there's a lot of pollution up there, and it's a very important area to study. So this is perhaps one of the more fun parts of this for me, because politics, even in America, is super important. So one of the first kind of hilarious things is that in the West and in America in particular, the president is kind of at the top, but you'll notice that they show at least that the president is below two other organizations. If you look at the details, it may be that China may never be a true communist country until they do away with a president. So one thing that's kind of interesting about the military is that they call each of their districts like the Western Theater or so on. So each district is actually called a theater.